Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Back up north to my hometown, Dundee, where the Scottish Labour Party conference is underway. Today's keynote speaker is the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, and he joins us now. John McDonnell, welcome. Can I ask you, first of all, about the story we've been talking about so far on the programme a lot, the poisoning attack in Salisbury. There is a suggestion in today's papers that the so-called Magnitsky Act, which really cracks down on Russian money coming into this country, removes visas and so on, should be applied in Britain too. Do you agree with that?
Yes, the Labour Party moved amendments to the money laundering bill only a week ago to introduce the Magnitsky clause. At that stage, the Conservative Party opposed our amendments. We hope now that they'll enable us to bring those amendments back at report stage of the bill so that we can have effective action. Because what Magnitsky does, it identifies those individuals who are basically found guilty of human rights abuses in particular. It prevents them then operating or having bank accounts in our country, and it effectively closes down all cooperation with them. Now, I think that could be remarkably effective. It was introduced several years ago by the Obama administration. We put amendments up, as I say, over a week ago. I don't know why the Conservatives opposed them. They said there were some technical issues. In fact, there was a bit of panic among Conservative ranks on the committee. Okay. Let's now work together on this, and let's use this effective legislation.
If this does prove to be a Russian attack, and I have to keep saying if, because we don't know yet, but if it does, then clearly there needs to be a very strong British response. Mrs. Litvinenko was suggesting that after the report into her husband's murder, the response simply wasn't strong enough. What would the Labour Party like to see if you were in power now?
We've got to work, of course, let's see the outcome of the investigation. You're quite right, we can't leap to any conclusions at the moment. But it doesn't matter whichever state it is, we've got to use every diplomatic method we can, linked up with our European and other global allies, to ensure that we isolate that particular administration if it is a state that's involved in this. It may well be a criminal operation. We don't know at the moment, but if it is a state, we cannot tolerate another state putting at risk people, our own citizens or people living in this country. So we've got to isolate them. And as I say, I think one of the methods we can do that, even if it's not the state and it's around an individual, is the sort of measures like the Magnitsky clauses that we were putting forward.
One very clear thing that you could do is stop appearing on Russia Today, which has been described by one of your own ministers as a Kremlin propaganda vehicle.
I think that's right now, and that's what I'll be doing. I've appeared on it in the past, sometimes to challenge some of the issues internationally and also to raise issues here that we're concerned about in terms of, well, not just Russia's role, but also the international scene overall. And I think that's right, because I think from what we're seeing from Russia Today at times goes beyond objective journalism from what I've seen. So, yes, I think that's right.
So this is a change in direction. Peter O'Dowd, your deputy, was on Russia Today only yesterday. Are you going to be encouraging the rest of your colleagues to follow that lead?
Yes, I am, because I've been looking overnight at some of what's happening in terms of changes in coverage on Russian television in particular, and I think we have to step back now. And I can understand why people have up until now, because we've treated it like every other television station. We've tried to be fair and making sure that, again, any country's television station, we try to be fair with them. And as long as they abide by journalistic standards, which are objective, that's fine, but it looks as though they've gone beyond that line. So, yes, we'll be having that discussion. I
mean, with respect, it was never really like any other television station, was it? Tom Watson, the deputy leader, said that Russia Today was reporting false or inaccurate stories and aligned its editorial policy to that of President Putin's Russian state, and that was back in November.
At times there's been examples of that, and I think now we need to take those into account, especially in this current climate, and that's what we'll do.
Let me turn to the economic story of the day, I suppose, which is that rare thing, a cheerful Philip Hammond statement in The Sun today, when he talks about wages going up by nearly 3%. He talks about paying off the day-to-day debt, finally suggests the end of austerity. The sunlit uplands are ahead. There is light at the end of the tunnel. Now, putting aside the politics, can you at least give two cheers for what appears to be a change in the economic story in this country?
No, because I don't think it's accurate. Last year, we had the lowest economic growth in the G7 countries, so we shouldn't be celebrating that. Austerity, this isn't me saying it, the head of the OBR has said it, the austerity is holding growth back. And wages now, wages are below what they were in 2007, 2008, below the banking crisis. So this isn't a matter of celebration. And you know, in terms of the deficit, we were promised by the Conservatives that they would wipe the deficit out completely 3 years ago. But I think it's not. I think what he's done, very cleverly, to be honest, very cunningly, he's shifted the deficit onto the shoulders of NHS managers, onto the shoulders of head teachers, and onto the shoulders of local government leaders. And his own local government leaders, Conservative council leaders now, are saying, I quote his own council leader in Surrey, that they're facing a financial crisis because the government cut back. So this isn't a matter of celebration. I think actually he should be coming into the real world, because as the Resolution Foundation have said in their reports today, 11 million people now, not just the poorest, but those just about managing, are going to be hit next month by the cuts in the support that they get through the benefit system. So this isn't a matter for celebration by any means.
Nevertheless, pay has been rising at an annual rate of 2.9% over the past 6 months. We've had the two strongest quarters of productivity growth, and the current budget surplus for the first time since 2002. Something is happening out there.
Well, look, you say on pay, inflation, pay is simply, at the moment, just about matching inflation, that's all. And then let's say that what else he promised, you know, that they would lift the pay cap. Look at what they're doing to health workers. They're offering them literally just a standstill wage increase, and then they're forcing them to give up a day's holiday pay. These are people who work long hours, dedicated staff in a vocation. I think it's just miserly, and I think it's mean-spirited, and this is the sort of thing we should be condemning, not celebrating.
Let me ask you about your own plans. You've said recently that your objectives are socialist, no surprise there. This means an irreversible shift in the balance of power and wealth in favour of ordinary people. When you say irreversible, what do you mean by that? Because governments come in, they have policies, they're replaced, the policies are replaced, and so on. What is irreversible about what you want to do?
Well, let's take the example of the Attlee government. What they did, they won the argument about how we manage our economy, and they won it for a generation, about how we manage the economy in the interests of everybody, how we establish a welfare state so everyone is looked after and cared for, how we give everyone a free education, free NHS. They won the argument for a whole generation. I think we're winning the argument now, and I think by embedding those, well, the understanding of how the economy could work for everybody, we'll be able to have irreversible change in this country.
Just round the corner from you in my hometown, there's lots of fishing communities up and down the East Coast in both directions, traditional fishing communities. Can I ask you, you have your own version when it comes to Brexit of cherry picking, in the sense that you want changes on state aid and workers' rights and so forth. So you need to have a proper negotiation in turn with Brussels. Would you be prepared to see continental-based fishing fleets coming into British waters as part of that negotiation?
Look, we want to ensure that our own fisher people lead the discussions that we're having about our future fishing industry. And what they're saying to us is, in any negotiations, you've got to ensure that our livelihoods are protected, but also you've got to ensure that the stock of fish is protected. So when we go into negotiations, they're the people we'll be listening to.
Now, of course, you say when you go into the negotiations, isn't the truth that it's much likelier, if you become Chancellor, that you become Chancellor after this deal is done? And in that context, can I ask you about the impact assessments you'll have seen this week? The government's produced lots of impact assessments about possible outcomes. Do you think they're, broadly speaking, accurate? I'm anxious about some of those impact assessments, because it does reflect, I think, the nature of the negotiations as they now are. It does reflect, I think, the inability of our current government to secure a decent negotiated settlement. And I think if you change the style of the negotiations, worked on the basis, and I've said this to you before, Andrew, I think that if you change the tone of these negotiations, so you recognise that we're negotiating on the basis of mutual interest and mutual benefit, we can actually
well, we can protect our economy and we can protect jobs. That's what we'll do in those negotiations.
So if these impact assessments are in any way accurate, this is quite bad news for any Chancellor of any stripe coming in. Tony Blair, I don't normally quote Tony Blair to you, but I'm going to today, said it's going to be extremely difficult, he said, for Labour to deliver on its promises if it puts itself in the same sort of position on Brexit. It will find it has less money to deal with the country's problems, and it'll going to be distracted by dealing with Brexit rather than the health service, jobs and living standards. He has got a point there. You are going to come in, possibly in a situation where you have a lot of trouble on your plate about Brexit, and yet you want a huge change in economic direction.
Well, I welcome Tony Blair's advice, obviously, but I'm saying this to you. Of course, I know we could inherit a real mess as a result of, well, the way the government is negotiating with the EU. I understand that. They are making, well, I don't, a Horlicks of it, I think someone on their own side described it as. I understand that. But I think we can resolve those matters by ensuring that we have, well, cooperation in those negotiations. We don't flounce about saying, though, no deal is better. Right. No deal is better than any bad deal. All this sort of stuff, threatening to walk away from the table. We've got to negotiate in the interests of our country and bring our country back together again. From day to day, Andrew, I do not know in this government who is negotiating on behalf, because they keep falling out in cabinet all the time. OK, well, listen, we'll talk more about this, I'm sure, but for now, enjoy Dundee, and thank you very much indeed. We've heard earlier on the Chancellor believes the economy is at last on the turn and there is light at the end of the tunnel. Well, that's a relief. But with a huge round of new welfare cuts looming and intense pressures on the health and defence budgets, does this mean he will actually put his hand in his pocket? Chancellor, I'll come on to that in a second. But can I start by asking you about this poisoning in Salisbury? If it's proved, and I say if it is proved to be an action of the Russian state, how serious is that for our relationship with the Russian government?
Well, first of all, as you say, this is a police investigation. It will be evidence-led, and we must go where the evidence takes us. So we have to allow the police investigation to take its course. But if there were to be an involvement of a foreign state evidenced by this investigation, then obviously that would be very serious indeed, and the government would respond appropriately.
You might have heard Marina Litvinenko suggesting that last time round the response wasn't nearly strong enough. And in that context, I wonder what you think now about the Magnitsky Act proposal, so-called, for much tougher visa restrictions and financial restrictions on named individuals.
Well, the proposals that were put forward actually create a power that we already have. The Home Secretary already has a power to exclude individuals from the UK if she believes that their presence here is not conducive to our national security or the public good. So it's not strictly necessary, but we're seeking to reach an accommodation with those who've put this amendment forward. Let's see if we can come to a proposal which works for everybody. OK. You were there as Foreign Secretary at the end of that Litvinenko inquiry, and you summoned in the Russian ambassador at the time. Marina Litvinenko suggests that what you did was not nearly tough enough. What's your message to her? Well, we did. The inquiry, of course, took some time, and it was some time after the events before we had the evidence from the inquiry. But we took appropriate steps. We took measures which are still in place today. But
of course, kicked out a couple of diplomats. That was about all.
But of course, the Russians have not complied with their international obligations, despite being members of the Security Council. They have continued to protect those who we seek to extradite in respect of the murder of Mr. Litvinenko.
And yet, in a sense, they are laughing at us in this country. They still think that this is a place where they can do what they like without any serious repercussions. And London is still one of the prime places for Russian money to arrive. Do you need to look at the whole thing again?
Well, I think the police inquiry and the depth and detail, the vast resources that have been deployed, and the high-level assets that we have to be able to make these analyses show that nobody is laughing at us. This is a very serious investigation that's going on. Let's see where it leads us.
Your party has taken massive donations from Russian oligarchs and others. Do you think it's time to hand them back?
Well, look, there are very strict rules about donations to political parties. Only British citizens who are on the electoral register here can make donations to political parties. All donations are carefully vetted. They're reported to the Electoral Commission. They're recorded publicly. The
facts have changed. Isn't it time to change your mind?
Well, look, I think there are people in this country who are British citizens who are of Russian origin. I don't think we should taint them, we should tar them with Putin's brush. We should recognise that people come to this country from many places. They become British citizens, they live under UK law, and they should have full participation rights in our society once they're British citizens.
Light at the end of the tunnel, a turning point for the economy. You've given lots of examples about wage growth. You've talked about the effect, finally ending the austerity years of paying back the budget day by day by day, and all of that. It feels like a really, really important moment.
Well, there is light at the end of the tunnel, because what we're about to see is debt starting to fall after it's been growing for 17 continuous years. That's a very important moment for us. But we are still in the tunnel at the moment. We have to get debt down. We've got all sorts of other things we want to do. We've taken a balanced approach over the last couple of fiscal events, using flexibility that we had to continue paying down debt, but also to provide additional support to our public services, to invest in Britain's future, and to reduce taxes for families and small businesses who are feeling the pressure.
Well, for the 11 million people about to be hit by the next round of welfare cuts, is there any light at the end of the tunnel? Are you going to be able to help them in any way at all?
Well, look, there's been quite a lot of speculation in the media about what the OBR numbers will be when they're published on Tuesday. I suggest we wait until we see the numbers. This is not a fiscal event in itself. I won't be making tax or spending announcements on Tuesday. What I will be doing is signalling some areas where we want to consult ahead of the budget in the autumn. We should be very careful about looking at single sets of figures, 1 quarter or 2 quarters. We need to look at what's happening sustainably in the economy. And if there is the flexibility, the space to do something, then we'll decide in the autumn how we're going to use that. But we will continue to take a balanced approach, addressing the debt problem, investing in Britain's future, reducing taxes for hard-working families, and putting money into our public services.
Simple question. Is austerity over?
Well, most people take that to be a reference to the public sector pay cap. Yeah. And we've removed the 1% pay cap on public sector pay. As you know, unions and management right now are in discussions on a settlement for nurses and other agenda for change staff in the NHS, which I hope will lead to a pay settlement which satisfies workers in the NHS, but is also fair to taxpayers, because it tackles some of the challenges that we have in the NHS workforce and makes it more effective and efficient. The
working families affected by these welfare changes, for instance, £200 a year worse off on average, that feels like no light at all at the end of the tunnel for them. Can I ask you also about local authorities? Because all across the country, you know, Tory local authorities as well as Labour ones are screaming with pain. They feel that austerity has been pushed absolutely to the possible limits, and that they are now, in the words of one of your colleagues, facing a financial precipice. Isn't it something you absolutely have to do ahead of these local elections to give them a little bit of relief at last?
Well, just to be clear, this is not a fiscal event on Tuesday, so I won't be making fiscal announcements. Local authorities have well over £200 billion of core spending power over the 5-year period from 2015 to 2020. They've got reserves of £23 billion. That's higher than in 2010, £8 billion higher than in 2010. But look, local authorities have done an incredible job in delivering efficiencies over the last few years. And of course they're under some pressures. We understand that. At the spring budget last year, I put an extra £2 billion into social care because of the pressures there. Local authority. We've also given them. We've also given them greater flexibility through the precept in the recent local government settlement, so that local authorities now have £9 billion worth of additional dedicated spending for social services over the next 3 years.
That is an actuarial answer to people who are screaming with pain in terms of the system being absolutely a breaking point.
And look, we understand that there are pressures in the system. We look at these all the time. We discuss them with colleagues across local government and indeed in spending departments across Whitehall. And as I said, when we get to the autumn budget, we'll look at the numbers then. I'll be paving the way in this autumn budget 2018 for a spending review in 2019, which will look at public spending from 2020 onwards, what the total envelope should be, how we allocate it between individual departments and indeed local government.
You're pushing off the good news until nearer the general election. Can I ask you about another really important issue on the Tory backbenches, which is defence spending?
Yes.
Tobias Ellwood, one of your own ministers, has said 2% is just not sustainable these days. We have to go up to around 3% because of what's happened to the pound and the dollar. You know, the entire military system is in real problems. They need more tanks, they need more planes, and a lot of your colleagues on the backbenches are determined that you're going to have to do something for them.
Well, look, I was Defence Secretary for nearly
Indeed.
3 years, and I yield to no one in my admiration for the armed forces and what they do to keep Britain safe. And I also understand...
They need a bit of cash as well as admiration.
I also understand the huge complexity of the defence budget, some very, very long-term projects that are at the cutting edge of technology. But some of the media talk as if defence was being cut. Let's just be clear about the facts here.
Well,
Defence will receive more than £1 billion extra in each year of this Parliament. It's the fastest growing resource budget in Whitehall. So defence isn't being cut by any means. Now, I accept that there are pressures on defence, including foreign exchange pressures, because quite a lot of the military equipment we use is bought in US dollars. And the Prime Minister has announced a defence modernisation programme where she and I and the Defence Secretary are working closely together on looking at these challenges.
Okay.
And of course we're committed to making sure that Britain is always properly defended.
But it sounds like yet more jam tomorrow. Can I read you something that Nick Timothy, your close friend, said? Mr Hammond must now declare an end to the age of austerity. The government has achieved its surplus. It can invest in the economy for the long term. It can start to increase public spending. Well,
I'm afraid Nick Timothy is ignoring the debt. We have a debt of £1.8 trillion, 86.5% of our GDP. All the international organisations recognise that that is higher than a safe level. And this isn't some ideological issue, Andrew. It's about making sure that we have the capacity to respond to any future shock to the economy. There will be economic cycles in the future. We need to be able to respond to them without taking our debt over 100% of GDP.
John Redwood, no kind of softy on these matters, wrote in a blog this week that basically the debt, in terms of if you analyse it properly, is easily sustainable, and really suggested that the austerity programme was a political choice, not an essential economic one.
Well, with the greatest respect to John Redwood, I think he's wrong. We need to get our debt lower. I think most people in this country would be horrified to be reminded that we have £65,000 worth of public debt for every household in this country. But look, what I did when I became Chancellor was change the fiscal rules. I said, we will tackle the debt, we have to tackle the debt, but we will spread out the time over which we do it a bit longer, creating a bit more flexibility so that at the same time as tackling the debt, we will also invest in Britain's future, we will also put money into Britain's public services, and we'll relieve Britain's families and small businesses with some tax breaks. That's what we've done. That's what we intend to go on doing, being balanced in our approach. It's wrong to say, as some fiscal hawks say, it's wrong to say that every penny of capacity we have has to go to paying down the debt, but it's equally wrong, as John McDonnell says, that every penny should go into additional public spending. We need a balanced approach.
I must ask you about Brexit. It's clearly going to be an incredibly complex negotiation. The Prime Minister said when I was talking to her last week that, you know, we wouldn't get the full amount of access to all markets we've got at the moment. You have a very, very complicated, grindingly complicated, difficult negotiation over the future of the City of London and financial services coming up. You spoke about that this week. Is it worth it?
Yes. Financial services is a very important part of our economy, but it's also...
Not the financial services negotiation. Is Brexit worth it?
Oh, the whole thing.
Yes, yeah, the whole thing.
The British people have decided. The British people decided that we are leaving the European Union, and that's what we're doing. Our job is to make sure that we get the best possible deal for Britain, that we make a smart Brexit, a Brexit that works for Britain, British jobs, British prosperity, British businesses. And that's what we're all about.
Do you accept that we're going to take some kind of economic hit, as Mr Tusk has said, and as a lot of these impact assessments suggest?
Well, look, Mr Tusk is a negotiator, and I listened to him carefully on Wednesday, and he didn't say anything that I wouldn't expect a skilled and experienced negotiator to say at the beginning of a negotiation. He basically said, the deal will have to contain none of the things you want and all of the things that we want. Well, that's an opening negotiating position. I recognise it well.
OK, looking at what you have said about the importance of financial services, banking and insurance in particular, you have said again and again and again, this has to be part of a fair deal. Can I ask you, is this at last a government red line?
We've said, the Prime Minister said very clearly in her speech that the way to negotiate successfully with the Europeans is not to threaten, not to talk about walking away from tables or anything like that, but to engage, to talk, to discuss these things, to explore the options. The reason I think that financial services has to be part of a deal is firstly the shape of Britain's economy. Services are a very important part of our economy, and a fair deal will need to be one that covers services as well as goods. And secondly, because the financial services system in London is an asset of Europe as a whole. It serves the European economy as a whole. £1.1 trillion worth of loans to European companies facilitated through the City of London. A vast proportion of Europe's financial services business transacted through the City of London.
But you know that they are thinking differently, and the French in particular are saying, you're not going to get this kind of deal. So if we get a deal that does not include financial services, that would be an unfair deal, that would be a bad deal.
Well, I don't accept your premise, Andrew, because I think we will get a deal that includes financial services. The question is how financial services are included, what the kind of access is that we're able to negotiate reciprocally, because there are many European banks operating in London, of course, as part of London's financial services.
OK, well, at least we now know what the government wants out of this negotiation. The Prime Minister's speech, your speech and many others have set out a much more detailed prospectus for the country. Have you modelled the economic effects of that?
Not yet. We haven't.
Why not?
We haven't even embarked on the negotiation yet. The next step in this process at the European Council later this month is hopefully to agree the implementation period so that businesses know that they can plan over the next 3 years with certainty. Then we will also get the guidelines from the European Union for the next phase of negotiation. Then we start talking with them about the shape of a future partnership, which will cover not just economics, trade and investment, but also security, domestic security and external security.
So modelling tomorrow, like jam tomorrow. But it will come.
Once we know what the deal looks like, then we will certainly model it.
All right, Chancellor of the thank you very much indeed.
Now, in a moment, I'm going to be picking up some of that with Mark Garnier and Emma Reynolds, but first, Allegra.
Well, our guest in a second is known to his mates as Spreadsheet Phil. We thought we would pick a few spreadsheets of our own to put to him. He's celebrating the UK's deficit finally becoming a surplus, but let's have a look at what the cost of that might have been. So, first of all, the NHS. What's happened to the NHS over the last 7 years? This is that target of how many people go to A&E and are seen within 4 hours. 2010, it was up at 95%. That's what they want. Here, it's now down very, very low. And for this winter, it was only at 77%. Truly terrible. Right, social care. This is quite complicated. Here, these are the number of days that are lost to patients waiting in hospital who are unable to go to the social care package out in the community. Those days lost were, back in 2010, still very high, 40,000. But look, it's now way up at 70,000. And then the police. The number of the police officers that have been lost since 2010, you can see it's way, way down, some 123 fewer of them. Now, this is actually the lowest level since 1996. Now, before you out there say this is a Corbynista rant, how dare you, it is not. Look, these are the Tories that are out there as uncomfortable about what is going on with austerity. Nick Timothy, former Theresa May advisor, he has said the Chancellor, should announce the end to austerity. In particular, he wants more NHS spending. Former Cameroon Minister Nick Bowles, he has said increase public investment by a dramatic amount. And then this is Paul Carter. He is the Conservative leader of Kent County Council. He's saying eventually the elastic will break. It's not just him. Lancashire Tory leader Jeff Driver and also the leader of Surrey Council, all, Robert, desperate for more funds.
So I'm delighted that Emma Reynolds and Mark Garnier are still with me. Mark, how much pressure from your colleagues and for you is the Chancellor under to be a bit more generous with public services. Now, he's making it clear that there aren't going to be any great announcements on Tuesday, but he will be saying there are reviews going on and the budget will be the moment. How generous should he be when the budget finally comes round in the autumn?
I mean, this is the fundamental question, of course, because, you know, when we arrived in Parliament, in government, we had a deficit of £156 billion a year. And that's now gone down very, very dramatically. It's now shrinking, as you said, as a percentage of GDP. But inevitably, we've still got to drive out waste. Now, the question is, at what point do you have you got rid of all the fat? When can you now say that we're down to those critical public services?
Well, I think many people working in the public services will say that we were into the bone. I mean...
Well, yeah, they did say a long time ago. But if you remember, back in 2010, people were saying, no, this is far too dramatic. And actually, we've worked harder and harder since then. Now, look,
but where do you personally stand? I mean, the public sector debt is still 85% of national income, which by historic standards is very high. Is the priority to get the debt down, or is the priority... I mean, Jacob was saying he wants to see a lot more money, for example, in the NHS.
Well, he was saying there's going to be a Brexit dividend, which I think both Emma and I would recognise that there is probably not going to be as big a Brexit dividend as some people are perhaps suggesting. But look, my view is I think we are getting close to the end of austerity, one way or the other. Maybe a few more months, maybe a year. But I think that most people are now feeling, you know, when I talk to my local council groups, they are pretty stretched. They're sort of saying we just don't know where we're going to go next.
Emma, do you think the political cycle is turning adversely for Labour? One of the reasons you did so well in the last general election is it was perfectly clear that lots of British people thought that the government should be more generous with public services, and your manifesto was all about being more generous. But if the public finances are now in a position where the government can start to be more generous, that's a big problem for Labour, isn't it?
Well, I don't think so, because inflation is running at 3%, which is high, which means that people's wages are stagnating, and actually imports, the price of things like, you know, your shopping, when you go around and you buy food, those things are going up because our exchange rate suffered when we voted to leave the European Union. And by the government's own figures, in 15 years' time, if we pursue the kind of Brexit that Theresa May and Philip Hammond want, we'll need £50 billion more a year in tax revenue. So that's not a Brexit dividend, that's a huge Brexit hit to the public finances.
Just very on a separate issue, something I was talking to Becky Long-Bailey about, how serious a problem for Jeremy Corbyn do you think it is that Unite and Momentum seem to be getting... You know, they used to be this force maintaining him in power, but they are having a bit of a go at each other over who should run the Labour Party.
Well, I think there should be a broader range of candidates for General Secretary.
Anyway, so you think the straight choice between Unite and Momentum is wrong?
I think that for such an important job, there shouldn't just be two applicants. I disagree with those who are saying that we should break the trade union link. The Labour Party grew from the trade unions. I'm a member of the GMB. So
those in Momentum, interestingly, who are talking about breaking the link, you'd actually be, in a sense, more of a union person than some Momentum people.
I am a trade unionist, and I think that most Labour MPs want to very much preserve that link. And I agree with Rebecca Long-Bailey. I think some of this has been over-sensationalised.
Who would you choose? If it was for you a straight choice between Lansman and Jenny Formby, who would you go for?
I'd like to see other candidates in the race.
Okay. I'm delighted that the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, is with me. Chancellor, on Tuesday, in your spring statement, not a budget,
Definitely not.
You're absolutely clear about, we will learn that for the first time since 2008, public sector borrowing, or debt, excuse me, public sector debt as a share of our national income is beginning to fall at last. So how big a moment is this? Is this the moment when the public sector squeeze can end?
Well, the OBR forecasts at the November budget that debt would begin to fall sustainably in 2018-19. That's the first falls for 17 years. So it is a very important moment. We've got our deficit down by 3/4 since the peak of 2010. We've seen the economy add 3 million jobs over that period.
The debt is still 86% of national income, though.
Exactly. You've stolen my next line, Robert. So although the light is there at the end of the tunnel, we're not out of the tunnel yet. And the reason this matters...
So you can't take the constraints off the
reason
public
this
sector.
matters is not that getting debt down is some kind of ideological obsession. It matters because a debt at 86% of our GDP is just not safe. It doesn't give us enough resilience.
If there's another crash?
Well, it doesn't have to be another crash. The economy goes in cycles, and there will be periods of slower economic growth in the future.
Oh, we're living through one now. It's a period of slower economic growth now, isn't it, John? Some would say it's because you're not spending and investing enough.
Haven't abolished the economic cycle, and we need to be prepared to manage our way through future economic cycles. So we do need to get debt down. But what I've done since I've been Chancellor is change the fiscal rules so that we are still targeting the deficit and getting debt down, but we're doing it over a longer period. That gives us more flexibility to invest in Britain's future, in infrastructure, in skills. It gives us the capacity to reduce taxes for hardworking families and businesses.
When will there be zero borrowing in a particular year?
And it gives us the capacity to put some money into our public services.
But when will there be zero borrowing in a given year?
Well, we're targeting the middle of the 2020s as the sort of a point where we reach balance.
So in numerical terms, I mean, I think what the debt in money terms is what, 1.8 trillion or something. So that debt is going to continue to go up and up and up.
No, that's exactly the point. The debt...
It will in absolute terms.
So what matters is the debt as a percentage of our GDP. And the OBR say...
It doesn't matter to the interest we pay. The interest we pay is related to the absolute size of the debt.
And our capacity to pay interest is related to the size of our economy. So the important thing, every economist will tell you, is the debt as a share of GDP. Clearly, a £1.8 trillion debt is a large debt for the UK economy. If that was the public debt of the US economy, it would be a much smaller proportion of GDP and much more manageable.
But just to be clear, therefore, 86% of GDP as a debt, you're saying, is too high. What's the right level?
Well, we want to get it down. Most economists think that debt needs to be below 60% as a long-term sustainable
Any
position.
idea of when we'll get to below 60%?
When we went into the financial crisis, we had debt
40%.
at around 35%,
yeah, 35%.
Of our GDP.
When will we get to 60?
Well, that's for the longer term. The key thing now is to make sure... Well, it depends how long you're planning on living, Robert. The key thing is that we get debt falling and falling sustainably.
Now, there's a lot of pressure from your backbench colleagues for you to nonetheless be more generous with public services, particularly health. Will you be more generous when it comes to the budget in the autumn?
Yes, so first of all, this is not a fiscal event, the spring statement. But
I think we've heard you say that a few times
well,
today.
I'm glad the penny's dropped. But as we come to the autumn budget, if we at that point have some fiscal capacity, there's some headroom available, we will use it as we used headroom at the autumn budget last year in a balanced way. We've got to keep reducing the deficit so that debt falls, but we've also got to support our public services. We've got to reduce taxes so that people keep more of the hard-earned money they earn, and we must keep investing in Britain's future, infrastructure and skills.
There are a lot of reports that there's about to be a much more generous settlement for a lot of NHS workers. Is that right?
Well, there's a negotiation going on between the unions and the management for a pay deal for nurses and Agenda for Change workers. And I very much
this number of a 6% increase over a period of 2 to 3 years, is that correct?
So I've been clear that in the specific case of Agenda for Change, if the management and the unions can reach a deal which, through workforce restructuring, pay restructuring, efficiency gains, can deliver productivity improvements to the NHS, then we will put extra money into the NHS next year to fund this. And I'm very optimistic that the unions and the management will reach a deal. But, of course, that deal will have to be put to the membership to vote on.
Now, on Russia, obviously it's not been proven that the Russian state was behind this attempted murder, but you were Foreign Secretary, you know quite a lot about this stuff. Do you believe Putin was behind this?
So there's a police investigation ongoing. This is clearly a police matter. This investigation could lead to criminal charges being made in the future, and it's very important that we don't in any way compromise or undermine the police investigation. So we must let the police do their work, and then the Crown Prosecution Service look at the evidence that the police amass. But we will be evidence-led. We will follow the evidence where it takes us, and on a purely speculative basis, if it does turn out that there is evidence that a foreign state is involved, obviously that would be very serious, and the government would respond accordingly.
I mean, there are reports that, perhaps unusually, you're with both Gavin Williamson and Boris Johnson on this, that if it turns out to be a state, if it turns out to be Russia, we've got to be very tough.
Well, I've been both Defence Secretary and Foreign Secretary in the past, so perhaps not that surprising that I might share some of the views of the current Foreign and Defence Secretary.
It's unusual, though, isn't it?
But I think that the important thing here is that we let the police do their work, we look objectively at the evidence, we don't get ahead of ourselves, and if there is evidence of a foreign state involvement, we will need to respond in a way that is appropriate and make sure that we do that in a measured and sensible way.
And is there stuff, I mean, because obviously some of this is stuff that you have to do through the Treasury in terms of sanctions. Is there stuff that Britain can at the moment do unilaterally, or would we have to seek agreement from the rest of the EU?
There are some things we can do unilaterally. There are some things that, while we're part of the European Union, we would need to do through persuading our EU partners to introduce measures. And there are some things which, frankly, whether we're in the EU or not in the EU, we could do on our own, but to be really effective, we would need to do in partnership with our allies.
And that, I suppose, is the point, isn't it? Doesn't this, in a sense, highlight one potential cost of leaving the European Union, that actually when you take sanctions against a state like Russia, it's much more effective to do it collectively with other countries, as we do in the EU?
Of course it is, and the Prime Minister's been clear that even once we've left the European Union, we would like to have a very close partnership with the European Union on defence and security policy, foreign policy approaches, so that we can work together where it's in our mutual interest to do so. And responding to actions of a foreign state in Europe would be one such area where we would look to cooperate together to make our actions more effective.
So actually, the Prime Minister of Luxembourg is, or was, completely right that the best definition of Brexit is we were in and sought lots of opt-outs, and we're now out, and we're seeking lots of opt-ins.
Well, once we're out, there certainly will be areas where we will still want to cooperate closely with our European Union partners. Security is one of them, but educational exchanges, research and development, technology and science, all areas where across Europe, universities, institutions, businesses have benefited enormously from the cooperation that we have across the continent of Europe.
Now, I'm delighted to say that although the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, insisted he would be leaving, actually this transition is going on, and he's still here. So on that issue, the EU has said that they want a hard end to the transition at the end of 2020. Is that a problem for us, really?
Well, we said that the transition period would need to be around 2 years.
Yeah, they're saying a bit under. Is that really a problem for us?
I think, 21 months, 24 months is probably not the big issue. We said that this needs to be based on a proper evaluation of how long we need to put in place the mechanisms that will leave us ready to operate smoothly outside the European Union.
What's your view? Do you think we will settle for the end of 2020? Is that long enough?
That's still a subject under discussion, so I'm not going to.
But just to be clear, because there are some of your colleagues who do get anxious about this, as and when we agree the formal transition deal, there will be a specific date in that deal for the end of transition.
Yes, there will. Both sides have said it has to be a fixed, specific period.
Yeah. And are you comfortable as Chancellor, because they've said that if we do want a slightly longer transition, we'll have to pay a bit of money for that. You know, we'll have to, in a sense, make a budget contribution. Are you happy about that?
Well, as I say, at the moment, they have indicated December, end of December 2020, and discussions are ongoing in Brussels. I'm not going to speculate on where they might end up, but I don't think we're going to argue over 3 months one way or the other.
And so 3 months' money, again, is not an issue, really?
Well, I'm not going to speculate on anything beyond. The point about December 2020 is that's the end of the EU's current budget period, the multi-annual financial framework. We wouldn't be getting involved in any future multi-annual financial framework. That's a red line for us. We definitely won't be doing that. If we did agree something that went beyond December 2020, it would be on the basis of a specific arrangement bilaterally agreed, and if any money was involved, it would be a specific fixed amount of money.
Now, when you came on this programme shortly after the Brexit vote, you were still Foreign Secretary, you were very, very clear that maximising Britain's access to the European single market really mattered. And you also said that in order to achieve that, we were going to have to be flexible on some of the issues which are now regarded as red lines. You were clear, for example, that we had to be a bit more flexible than you thought some of your colleagues would want to be on migration. Do you now recognise, therefore, that we are going to end up being a bit poorer because politically you cannot have that flexibility?
Well, what the Prime Minister said in her speech just over a week ago is that this is a negotiation. We have to recognise as a nation that there will be consequences flowing from the decision we've taken. Life will not go on exactly as before. There will be differences, and neither side will be able to get everything that it wants. That's the nature of a negotiation. So the process that we'll be going through once we get into the substantive negotiations on our future partnership, we'll be looking at these various trade-offs. There are lots of things we want. There are lots of things the EU want, and we will have to have a proper negotiation about where we end up.
But have your views changed since the referendum? Do you still take the view that it would be worth being a bit more flexible, for example, on migration, if we got a better deal when it comes to trade?
Well, I think we always have to look at the trade-offs, the balances. I do think there are big advantages for the UK in maintaining access to our established markets in the European Union. More than half of our exports into the European Union are not finished products that you could easily divert to other markets. They're intermediate products going into supply chains, for example, in the integrated car industry that operates across Europe. Those manufacturers, those suppliers of UK components won't find readily alternative markets in other countries outside Europe for their products. So I think there is great value in maintaining as much access as we can. There's also huge value to us in maintaining a smooth flow of goods at the border, smooth processes at the Dover-Calais border, at all our borders, but Dover-Calais in particular, where huge amounts of goods flow both ways every day. And it's in nobody's interest to have long delays, additional costs, bureaucratic complications at the border. So those are clear objectives for us. But on the other hand,
there's also that really important Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland.
And of course,
border.
there's the commitments we've made, the very clear commitments we've made not to reintroduce border infrastructure in Ireland.
But there will have to be some border infrastructure, won't there?
On the other hand,
could I just check, do you think there'll have to be some border infrastructure?
No, we've said no border infrastructure. We're very clear there will be no border infrastructure reintroduced on the Northern Ireland
And you
border.
Genuinely think we can achieve that without being members of a customs union?
Yes, I do. We have, at the moment, we have an excise border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, but there is no infrastructure there at all. It is policed by an intelligence-led approach with collaboration between police forces and customs authorities on both sides of the border to make sure
there
that
is no precedent, or there's no model for the kind of border you want anywhere in the world.
No, there isn't, and that's why no existing off-the-shelf model is going to deliver what we need to deliver here.
Now, on fisheries, you, I think, have indicated that you would be open to negotiation to allow EU fishermen into our waters. Some of your colleagues are less keen on that. Where's that going to end up?
Well, let me remind your viewers, my colleagues, what the Prime Minister said, that we will take back control of our waters when we leave the European Union.
But will we let European fishermen into our waters?
We will become an independent coastal state. Now, that means it's up to us to decide whether we would let European fishermen into our waters and on what terms. And clearly, our commitment is that we will ensure the prosperity of our coastal communities in the UK. That means making sure that British fishermen get a better deal in the future than the one they've had in the past. But that may well involve wanting to negotiate with the European Union reciprocal access rights. It'll certainly involve negotiating shared arrangements on management of fishing stocks. Fish don't stop when they get to a median line.
Very annoyingly, although what you're saying is absolutely gripping, I'm afraid I do have to cut you off because, sadly, that's all we've got time for.
On Tuesday, the Chancellor will deliver his spring statement. With Labour calling on the government to put more money into local authorities to pay for things including social care. Labour's Chief Secretary to the Treasury is Peter Dowd, and he joins me now. Very good morning to you. So what exactly do you want to see from the Chancellor this week? He's got a bit of wiggle room, doesn't he?
He does have some wiggle room, but the bottom line for us is we've got terrible stresses in social care, adult social care, disabled social care, and increasingly stresses in children's care. I mean, there are now about 75,000 children in care. I mean, that's enough to fill Wembley Stadium. So we need action in those areas. Amongst all the rest of them, roads are beginning to crumble, education services are under pressure, schools are under pressure. I mean, the whole of the public realm, certainly in relation to local government, is under terrible strain.
So can we be very specific then? What do you want the government to do then?
Well, what we've said to the government, we want them to put an injection into children's social care of around about £2 billion, and in relation to adult social care, to get that moving, to just take the stresses and strains off them. They've got to fill in the hole that they've left local government in with £5.6 billion worth of cuts over the past few years. So there needs to be almost an emergency injection into local government to plug some of those holes. I mean, you mentioned social care, and it's a topic that we've kind of featured on this show a number of times, and there's clear that there are stresses and strains there. But the wiggle room of which I talked about is only due to the fact that the government's now running a surplus on day-to-day spending. I mean, you must welcome that, then. Well, of course you welcome anything that makes the public finances better, but let's not get carried away. We've still got virtually the lowest growth of any of our competitors. Our productivity levels are 35% worse than the Germans. The whole of the economy is not doing well. And whilst the economy is not doing well, you can't pay down the debt, you can't reduce the deficit as much as you'd like, and you can't invest into public services. That's what we've got to tackle.
Still, I mean, there are those cynics, perhaps, who would suggest that there isn't a problem that exists in British politics for which the Labour Party answer is not throw more money at it. I mean, are the problems when it comes to local authority funding, we're talking about social care, education, a number of areas, I mean, does it simply boil down to the fact that they're not getting enough?
Well, it boils down to the fact that the government over the past few years chose to make cuts into the public realm rather than deal with it in a different way, which is investment in the economy. So that money that they've taken out of particular services does nothing for the economy overall. So you can't look at it just in the isolation of looking at local government expenditure or expenditure in the public realm. You've got to look at it as part of an investment programme into the economy. That's the key. So Labour will invest in the economy. That's the key to this. That's the key to get sustainable economic growth, of investment in the economy.
I wonder if we could turn to those horrific events in Salisbury. What do you feel that the government's response should be? I mean, we just had Sam Jima on a moment ago saying that we have to wait and see. But I mean, what should the government response be, given it does look, once again, that this is another incident of state-sponsored assassination on our soil?
Well, I think, first of all, we do have to wait for the inquiry. We've got hundreds of officers and security services working on this, the police. We've got to make sure that that job is done, well, which it will be done professionally and expertly, and wait for the outcome of that one. But I think this sets the mood music that the government have been operating in relation to, for example, the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Bill. My colleague Annalise Dodds moved an amendment in relation to the Magnitsky Clause. That is whereby you can take sanctions against, for example, oligarchs, Russian oligarchs, in relation to anti-money laundering crime. And the government rejected that. So I think that's the context that the government have been operating within, is that they just seem to be ignoring these issues. And, of course, the fact that they've had money from some of these oligarchs in the past as well. So it's the mood music that this has been as well. That's got to be tackled.
But given it looks like an attempted assassination, given the Alexander Litvinenko case, the public inquiry in 2016 that not only concluded that a former Russian spy was responsible, but that it had been given the nod by Vladimir Putin. I mean, given that, shouldn't we just, as a matter of course, accept the fact that Russia is one of a handful that could be responsible for this and take action appropriately? I mean, I mentioned in my interview with Sam Jima, I mean, the Russian embassy sending out sarcastic tweets about incidents which have seen, a number of people hospitalised and coming very, very close to death.
I think what we've got to do is to find out this issue about proportionate action. I think you can take proportionate action, but it's got to be in the context of the extent of what the Russians have been alleged to have been doing and get the full picture. And then, rather than take an action that you then up or reduce in due course, you actually take the action once you know all the facts. That's the best position to be in. So you could take action now. You could, I mean, I heard you talk about, ask for the Russian ambassador to be withdrawn. You can do all sorts of things. The question of whether that's appropriate, given what would come out of the investigation, is a different kettle of fish.
OK, but was it then appropriate for you to appear on Russia Today this week, given the fact that, as we've both accept, there are a handful of state actors that could have been responsible for this, and frankly, Russia's at the top of that list?
Yes, I appeared on Russia Today the week before last. I think it was put on the actual television at the beginning of the week, and I've appeared on Russia Today on a number of occasions, like I would appear on many programmes. We'll review...
Do you accept a fee from them? Because we don't pay politicians.
No.
I'm glad to...
Not. No.
But you don't see anything wrong with...
No, what I said is that in the light of the fact that of these events, we will sort of review that. But I've got to say, I would appear, and I do appear on programmes. Anybody who asks me to appear on a programme, I'll make that decision.
But should you, though? I mean, this is the thing. I mean, John McDonnell, speaking earlier elsewhere, suggests that it's because of the quality of the journalism. And the complaints that have been made about RT's journalism have been made, going back further even than your appearance on RT the week before last.
Yes, I mean, and I think that in the light of events this week, of course, we will undertake a review of what we do in regards to these, as you will always do in these sort of circumstances. But I have to emphasise that what I try to do is to come onto television programmes like this and answer the questions that are put to me. It's not for me to ask the questions, it's for other people to ask the questions, and if I can answer them to the best of my ability, I will do so.
Indeed, and as we well know, your party leader is very, very keen on speaking to both sides of every argument. Just in terms of the structure of the Labour Party at the moment, what's your view of the role that the party membership should make in formulating policy?
Well, we have national policy forums which they can participate in, and there are lots of ways in our party that people feed into the debate. I mean, for example, about 4 weeks ago, we had a debate in my constituency about the whole question of Brexit, and I listen to those views. I take those views back to Westminster. We have a range, both informal and formal mechanisms.
If it was correct for you to have a debate on Brexit in your constituency, why wasn't it correct for the Scottish Labour Party to have a debate on membership of the single market?
Well, I suspect that these debates are all over the place. We have debates
not at the Scottish Labour conference this week, at which motions were tabled to be debated around single market membership, and they were removed.
Well, I suspect they were part of the whole of the policy commission process, where they would be taken in the international affairs section. The point I was trying to make is that the party debates these things in a whole range of fora. On an individual level, I speak to members of my constituency party all the time on these sorts of things. So it's a plural, three-dimensional approach to debates on a whole range of subjects.
Yeah, but it's fair to ask, who are the strongest pieces on that three-dimensional chessboard that you're mentioning a second ago? I mean, yeah, the membership have a role to play. 87%, according to a poll out at the beginning of the year, 87% of Labour members believe in continued membership of the single market after we leave the European Union. I mean, where is their voice being heard in all of this?
Well, of course the voice has been heard, but it's every other way. It's in the context of that. We did have a referendum, and that is important as well. So the public have also spoken on this particular issue. The public have said they want to leave the European Union, and we've got to try and balance all those, competing views in policy terms.
But does it not strike you that you want to hear the voice of the party, the rank and file, the one member, one vote? You want to hear their voice up until the point at which what they say doesn't chime with what the leadership say? It doesn't strike me as particularly democratic.
Well, democracy isn't about just having a debate in a particular forum at a particular time. Democracy is about, as I said, multidimensional. It's about a whole range of issues and a whole range of points and discussions that you have to have, and you then try to reach a consensus on that. But this is particularly in the context of the fact that we did have a referendum. That is the elephant in the room that we can't ignore.
The problems with the membership and who's running the party, be it the unions, be it the kind of the momentum, all of that, I mean, they seem most obvious around the debate around who should be the next General Secretary after Ian McNicol. Now, the unions are clearly pushing Unite's Jenny Formby. John Lansman seems to be the candidate of the membership. I mean, shouldn't a post as senior as General Secretary be decided by a vote by the membership? One member, one vote. I mean, that's what they're calling for.
Well, the current arrangements, and they've always been the arrangements, is the NEC appoint the General Secretary. It's always been the case. Now, if the rules need to be changed in due course, that's a matter for the party to have those debates at the conference and make a decision accordingly. But at the end of the day, the current position is that the NEC will make those decisions, having interviewed the people concerned, whoever throw their hat into the ring.
But who should take precedence in a debate over policy? Should it be the unions or should it be the members?
Well, it's a balance. The Labour Party's always had that balance between the members and the trade unions and the affiliated organisations, the socialist organisations, the Cooperative Party, the Socialist Health Group. I mean, the party's got a whole range of organisations that feed into it, and that you then reach a consensus. That's what the Labour Party is about.
Yeah, but it's getting farcical now, isn't it? It's getting quite farcical. I mean, you've got Christine Shawcross, who's been placed in charge of disputes with the assistance, frankly, of Unite Votes, who's now calling for the unions to be disaffiliated.
Well, that's her particular view. And the Labour Party was set up by the trade unions 100 years ago. I think that is a view that she has. I think she's most probably in a club of one in regards to that one. And I hope she stays in that club of one in regards to that, because nobody's wanting the trade unions to disaffiliate whatsoever.
Peter Dowd, lovely to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.